And welcome to the Ask More Questions podcast. Today, I'm here with Dr. Luke Wilson. Lucas Wilson. I've already screwed it up. But you just want to differentiate that you're not the actor, is basically what I'm getting. Like,
That's
you're
literally
not.
it.
Yeah.
I'm never gonna win in a Google search against Luke Wilson, so I have to, whenever it's anything professional, I have to be Lucas Wilson, which is my name, I suppose. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
it's
it's
a
your name. I mean, it's kind of like Office Space. Have you seen Office Space where they talk about Michael
course.
Bolton? Yeah, so but yeah, you're always going to be fighting SEO, trying to get that top ranking, and it'll be even more confusing if you ever get into acting.
Yes.
So tread with caution. So, well, thanks for joining me today. We're going to be discussing a topic that I found interesting because you have a book called "Shame, Sex Attraction: Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy." Now, last year, I decided that for during Pride Month that I would go through and watch a lot of how do I put this nicely and accurately? Here we go. I decided to watch movies about a topic that isn't real familiar to me because I read an interview with Taylor Swift talking about the LGBTQ plus community and how she said, "Oh, I just think it's so great that people look up to me," or whatever. I can't remember exactly what she said, but she said, even though I'm not part of that community. And so she was acknowledging, like, hey, that's not me, but at the same time I feel a responsibility toward that community. And I was like, yeah, well, I I also feel a responsibility to just treat people nicely, and like they're humans and worthy of value. And so, but part of that is knowing some of their backstory, right? Knowing some of the history. So I watched things like Milk, and then let's see, what was some other, like Dallas Buyers Club, and then I did also watch But I'm a Cheerleader on a recommendation, which I found to be hilarious and sad because it does deal with conversion therapy. And so the whenever I saw that you had written a book about this topic, I thought, oh man, that'd be great to talk about a little bit about this. But in addition to that, you're also a former believer like myself, and like myself, you also walked away. So why don't we start off? We'll talk a little bit about your personal experience with faith and then the lack thereof, and then yeah, we'll talk about your book. So let's go back to the beginning. Tell me where it all started,
Yeah,
like
well,
where
I
you
was born
grew
and
up
raised.
and stuff.
Yep, born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada.
Okay.
I come from a family of 5 kids, but
Wow.
despite the size of our family, we weren't, a Christian family, which typically, when you're a big family, you think, religious or something along those lines, but
Right.
we weren't. I think at
Yeah.
best we were haunted by my mom's Baptist demons that she grew up with.
Oh, fun.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it was a good time, all in all. But my mom was, how do you say, like, she wasn't religious in any sense. But every so often when we were kids, we would go to church, and then for a while, I guess we would go on and off, semi regularly. But by the time
Uh-huh.
I was in about grade 2 or 3, and I'm the youngest of all of the kids in my family, we stopped going to church. Like every good Canadian family, we went to the cottage instead. And so we would do that on the weekends and not go to Forward Baptist. And so for a long time, I was out of the church. Like when I was young, it was sort of in and out, on and off. But by, again,
Uh-huh.
grade 2 or 3, we weren't in the church. So when I went into high school, this is when I became an evangelical. I sort of had like
Uh-huh.
a return to my roots moment, largely because my brother got into the creation versus evolution debate.
Yeah.
And I thought, look how fascinating this is. At first, he was like, "Luke, you got to watch these DVDs." And it was Kent Hovind. Do you know Dr. Dino out of Pensacola, Florida? Have you heard of him?
I don't know if he's on my list
Count
or
your blessings.
not.
Count your
So,
blessings
uh,
if
uh,
you've not heard of
okay.
him. But I started watching these DVDs. He's this creationist who eventually went to jail. He said it was
Oh.
God's money, not the government's money, and the government seemed to disagree with him.
Yeah, sure.
But it makes sense. And so
Yeah.
Quinn, my brother, got me really into this sort of debate. And at first I was like, I don't want to, watch a bunch of like, debates between creationists and, scientists. But then when I watched it, I sort of, was attracted to I guess what you'd say is like the bombastic nature of, well, most evangelicals, where it's this like oversimplification of a theory, in this case, the theory of evolution.
Mhm.
Um, and then sort of attacking it and then making jokes about it, but all in the name of like Christian love and sort of like whatever sincerity. And so
Yeah.
it was just a super like bizarre looking back sort of entrance into the church, but that really was, how I got involved. And so I
Mhm.
started watching these movies. I then decided, okay, if I believe that, there's a creator, it must be the God or the creator that I learned about when I went to church, down the street. So I
Yeah.
started going to that church again. Got, heavily involved right away. The youth pastor took a liking to me and I was just sort of hooked. And it was at the time that I was at Rosedale Heights School of the Arts. So I was at this like public art school, like no Christians. I mean, Toronto's not a religious place.
Mhm.
In a lot of ways, it's just sort of like a very cosmopolitan city. And I was one of like maybe like 3 Christians in my high school. And so I became sort of this like evangelical zealot and was out there like like preaching to my friends and telling them to come to church with me, and a bunch of them did. They all thought it was hilarious. They were like, "This is just bonkers." But I was,
Mhm.
thinking the world for Jesus and fulfilling the Great Commission. And so he or a bunch of my friends, would come every so often, and I was the one that obviously was there on a weekly basis. And so by the time I got, it was about time to think about where I wanted to go to university. I eventually narrowed it down to 2 schools, and the 2 schools were Liberty University, Jerry Falwell School
Mhm.
in Lynchburg, Virginia,
Yeah.
and the University of Toronto, which is arguably, Canada's best institution. And I made the really wise decision to go to Liberty University. And back, you think to yourself, like, what decisions did I make? Terrible ones,
Yeah.
obviously. But and a big reason why I went to Liberty, I mean, there were a few reasons, but the biggest sort of motivating factor as to why I eventually ended up there was because I knew that they had a conversion therapy program. I had gone
Okay.
down and visited campus a bunch of times before I eventually went. But I, I knew that they had this guy on campus. His name was Pastor Dane Emmerich, and he was a paid university employee who worked with 2 groups of students: those who were quote unquote addicted to porn, and of course you can't be
Mhm.
addicted to porn. There's no such thing as porn addiction. And then those who were quote unquote addicted to homosexuality, and I was like guilty on both accounts. So I was like, Yep. So I eventually, when again I was making my decision, this was really the biggest factor as to why I ended up there. And so off to
Mhm.
Liberty I went, and into conversion therapy I went as well.
So you're telling me you went to a religious school because it had a conversion therapy adherent proponent on the staff, and you're like, sign me up. That sounds like a good idea. That's something like I'd like to be involved in.
Well, you know what? This is it though, right? Because it's like this is of course my like retrospective recounting of it, but at the time, I didn't even think about it as conversion therapy.
Mhm.
I of course knew what conversion therapy was, but it wasn't like I ever thought that what I was doing was that. When I was in the church, when I was a person of faith, I was under the impression, I was made to believe that I could not be both queer and Christian. And so
Mhm.
if I wanted to, remain within the fold, I had to therefore
Got to
either
pick one
become
or the other, right?
celibate.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. And of course, evangelicals live in the binary. It's either or, right, wrong, good, evil, of the enemy of
Mhm.
God, whatever. And so I thought, well, I don't want to be celibate. That sounds horrible. But I also don't want to leave Jesus because, well, that means, a one-way ticket to hell. So what's my option? I have to change. And so
Mhm.
I, this pastor on Liberty's campus, it was framed as pastoral counseling, which, we all know the efficacy
Yeah.
of pastoral counseling, but I
Please
was,
don't do that.
as exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I was a 17, then an 18 once I started at Liberty, a year old sort of, uh, well, I was a teenager and I thought I have to change. And so this would be the best way to change. And I didn't know of any other options or other sort of alternative paths. I just knew that Liberty had this guy on campus who I could, quote unquote, work with. So
Yeah.
for me, that's how I thought about it. And again, now looking back, I think about it quite differently. But for me, it was like, well, I have to do something about me being a big old homo and what to do, but I'll meet with this guy.
Mhm. Yeah, I could see that. I mean, I guess if your faith is so important to you and if you struggle with something else, I mean, it could be no different than like, being addicted to alcohol, for instance. And you're like, oh, well, you should go here because, not only is it religious, but it also, they got a great AA program or something like that that's really solid. So I understand that. It's just, I'm sure that, and I can hear it in your voice that, looking back at it now, you're like, oh, I didn't realize I was going to change my mind about some other things. So how long did you go the whole time there? Or yeah, okay. And then at what point did Anne? I mean, this is a common question that gets asked, and maybe it's obvious, but at what point did you start rethinking, and then like what was the impetus to rethink faith in your life?
Hmm. Yeah, so I was there for all 4 years. I did my undergrad there, regrettably, and for all 4 years, regrettably, I was in their conversion therapy program or programs, I guess, because I went to the one-on-one program with him throughout the entirety of my undergrad. But I only
Uh-huh.
went once to the group conversion therapy program. And that's actually the story that I write about in Shame, Sex, Attraction is the group program, because for my next book, I wrote about the one-on-one program. But in that, throughout those 4 years, I mean, I was in it to win it. I again thought that this was good for me. And of course, like within the upside down sort of like cosmology or moral universe of evangelicalism, what they think is right is oftentimes not. And what they think is wrong is oftentimes not. But again, that was sort of the world in which I found myself, and that's how I operated. And so I understood what this man was doing, this guy, Pastor Dane, as good, as beneficial, as like something that I needed in order to
Uh-huh.
again continue it, in the church. So when I went to grad school, first I went back to Canada for my MA, and then I went back to the States for the rest of my graduate work. But for when I went to in when I was doing my MA in English, I was in my office with one of my office mates, and we were just like chatting about my time at Liberty, and because she was fascinated, and everyone was. They're all like tell us more about this weird school that you went to, because there was no one else obviously like my
Yeah.
program. And so I told her, and then I told her, about, Pastor Dane, and she goes, "Oh, so you went through conversion therapy?" And I was like, um, I guess so. Like I just had, again, never conceptualized it like that. I just always thought
Yeah.
about it as meeting with the pastor. And then, if you do like the quickest amount of like digging and looking up, the definition of conversion therapy, I checked every box. Like it was like a definitional account of conversion therapy. So from that point forward, I mean, like once you have language to describe something, it changes how you are able to like interact with whatever that thing that's being described. So, if you don't
Yeah.
have the words to describe that, like let's say go back 100, years, and there weren't words, or I guess 150 years ago, um, there weren't words for homosexuality and heterosexuality. These words were not in the modern lexicon until about the mid 1800s. Before that, people obviously knew that they were different, but when they didn't have the words to describe it, it's harder sort of to like figure out, who you are and again, how you operate in the world. And so once all of a sudden I had this language to describe my experience as conversion therapy, wheels started turning, and I was like, okay, so that was messed up. That clearly didn't work, and it, was harmful. But at the time, like when I was doing my MA, I was still really thinking a lot about my relationship between my faith and my sexuality. And so I went to divinity school after my
Okay.
MA. I went down to Nashville, and it was there that I started to really think about a lot of these things, and really started to begin my deconstruction process, because I was still a person of faith for sure. But I was at least at that point deconstructing my evangelical sort of commitments, faith commitments. I was realizing I don't believe that, the Bible is God's word. I think these are words about God. And of course, for those of us who come from that world, that's a huge shift. For those outside of our world,
Yeah.
or, those of us, who come from the world, it sounds like something minor, but I thought that every single word in the Bible up until that point were God's words. And when I had that sort of epiphany, I remember I was sitting in my Hebrew Bible class, and I was listening to my professor, and I was like, oh wow, I just don't believe that God said this. And at the time I was like, I still think it's a sacred text. I still think it's, an important text. I don't anymore. But for me personally, at least. But I
Yeah.
thought, like it can still be, again, a sacred text without being necessarily like all of God's words, put into one single book. Obviously multiple books within a book. Anyway, so
Yeah. I know. I
I
have to
started to,
deal with that a lot too, where I hear people, I'll say a book and they're like, no, it's multiple books. I'm like, just make it simple.
yeah, come
I
on,
understand what it is. Yeah.
exactly. So I started to that was the sort of like um uh the gateway for me, that a lot of like it allowed me to start to really engage with a lot of the questions I had been thinking about, again, how I understood myself as a queer person, and as a Christian. It allowed me to really just open up the door and actually start to, think for myself. Because up until that point, if you're circumscribed by a framework that says you can't challenge anything God says, everything in the Bible, and it's of course according to a very specific interpretation. But at the time I thought,
Hmm.
this is what the Bible says. And of course the Bible doesn't say anything. It's what we bring to the text. But putting that aside, um, for me at the time, it was this like revelatory moment where all of a sudden I was able to start to really grapple with a lot of the questions I wanted to, in a really intellectually honest way, because up until that point, evangelicalism is not known for its intellectual honesty. And so I had to really put aside a lot of a lot of the questions I wanted to ask, but I couldn't. So at this point, realizing I didn't believe that it was God's word anymore, that allowed me to really, again, start to think critically. And it was this sort of like revelation in tandem with, when I went to Nashville, I said to myself, okay, when I get there, I'm going to theorize about God. And of course, theology is just theory about God. But I was going to theorize about God second and live first, as opposed to theorizing first, putting my interpretation of scripture, as sort of like the guiding framework for my life, and then living second after that. I was going to switch it and turn it on its head. And I thought to myself, I'm going to let my lived experience shape my theory, as opposed to letting my theory shape my lived experience. And so it was this really liberatory sort of like moment as well, where all of a sudden I was like, you know what? I'm going to go to a gay club and see what happens. And I'm not going to go there with this idea that it's wrong. I'm instead going to go, enjoy myself. And then if I still think it's wrong afterwards, okay. But if I don't, then that's going to be how I'm going to sort of, approach the world from this point forward. And it was really because I had no one in Nashville I knew. I knew one gal, but she didn't, she went to we weren't in the same world. So, or sort of like circles. So this was really, again, a moment for me that allowed me to start to live and think differently. But I
Yeah.
was still a person of faith even after I finished divinity school. And when I eventually went and did my PhD, it was then that my faith really sort of crumbled, and thank God it crumbled. Because I remember, so for me, most of my academic background is in Holocaust studies. And so I looked at the
Oh,
antecedents of
another fun topic. Yeah.
this is always it, right? It's like I researched
You know how to
conversion
pick them, don't you?
the Holocaust. Yeah. So I went down, I did my PhD in Florida. Another big mistake, but neither here nor there. Apparently I made a lot of really, unwise decisions for a very long time. But I was, again, in Holocaust studies, I was looking at the antecedents of the Holocaust. I looked at, how Christian theology laid the seedbed for the Holocaust. And then I looked at
Uh-huh.
the aftermath of the Holocaust. So I looked at the intergenerational transmission of trauma between survivors, their kids, and their grandkids.
Yeah.
And I remember I was taking a class on Elie Wiesel, who's probably the best known Holocaust survivor. If Anne Frank's the best known Holocaust victim, Elie Wiesel's the most, well-known survivor. And so I was taking a class on his work and sort of life. And I remember I was sitting on my couch. It was in Boca Raton, Florida. And I was just chilling. And well, actually, I was reading Wiesel's work, and I took a break. And, I was probably reading, or probably was on like Instagram or something like that, but I don't remember which exact social media platform. But what happened was I saw that some gal I knew had posted about getting like a free Starbucks coffee. And she was saying that she was blessed that God had given her a free Starbucks coffee. And I remember sitting there being like, what the hell are you talking about? And it was this
Mhm.
moment where, again, my entire faith just unraveled within a matter of like minutes. I was just sitting there and I was like, okay, so this person thinks that God gave her, out of God's like infinite sort of like compassion, a free Starbucks
Right.
coffee. Like God took time out
Sure.
of God's day to give this gal a coffee. And I was thinking to myself, and then of course, most likely there was going to be someone, outside of that Starbucks who actually needed a free Starbucks and couldn't afford it and didn't have a home or whatever. Like I thought to myself, so wait, so God, you think that God went out of God's way and gave you that coffee, which is an active decision on God's part. And if God's giving coffees to some people but not other people, i.e. the person who's again like asking for money outside, like that's an active decision on God's part as well, not to give the coffee. So I
Mhm.
just was like, how in the world can I reconcile this faith that again God's interacting with humans and giving people free things here, helping people here but not there. I just thought, wait a second, that's impossible that God would like do that if God's good. And then I was like, but then maybe God just can't act. But I was like, but if God doesn't act, then that's also like an immoral thing. And again, it was just all of this moment, this
Yeah.
like sort of theodicy. How do I reconcile, a fallen quote unquote world, evil world or evil with a good God? And I was like,
Yeah.
I can't reconcile those two things in an intellectually honest way. And then I was just like, I'm done. And it was just in that moment, I was like,
That's
and I
amazing.
am no longer a Christian. It was,
Yeah.
and
That
pardon me.
Oh, no, it's amazing to me that, for me, I mean, my upbringing is Southern Baptist. And then as I got older and decided I didn't want to hate myself anymore, like I kind of leaned more into, more laissez-faire, so went to non-denominational churches, but they were, they probably still had a little bit of like traditional underpinning to them, but not so much. I mean, I did have a female pastor at one time, so a woman pastor. So, um, so I can't really say that it was that tied to my Southern Baptist upbringing because that's pretty different. You don't really have women in the pulpit in the Southern Baptist church. But you know, over time, it took me a long time, and for you, it was just a fucking coffee, and I love that. I love that like your brain just like processed and melted all at the same time. And I wish it would have been that quick for me, but it took like I don't know, year and a half, 2 years for me to like fully weed myself out of it. It was difficult. So, I'm glad you went to Starbucks that day. That's all I'm saying.
Thank God for Starbucks. No,
Yeah.
but you know what? It certainly was like a moment, but I also think that a lot of that sort of theoretical or intellectual like groundwork had been laid for years.
Sure.
I think for a long time when I was within the church, again, I was just, I mean, certain questions within the evangelical imagination, obviously emphasis on imagination, are dangerous, right? Even having any, like to ask questions and to have doubts, like these are coded as
Mhm.
like a threat to your faith, and you don't want to explore those too much because you might, go out into liberal la land and then lose your faith. And of course, that is what happened. Like I did eventually lose my faith because I went into quote unquote liberal la land.
Yeah.
And again, thank God. But I think that for me, it was a lot of like grad school. I always say saved my life. Like if it were not for grad school, I'd probably be married to a woman with children and like wildly
Mm.
unhappy.
Yeah.
And I think
And not authentic. Yeah.
exactly. And I think
Yeah.
that at this point, if I were to go back into the church, which I never will, but if I were, I think it would be a matter of like I'd be sacrificing both intellectual honesty and also, like you said, authenticity. I think that
Mhm.
the evangelical church is defined by intellectual, well, a lack thereof, a lack of intellect, and also a lack of authenticity. You have to perform. You have to follow the script. You have to do what is expected of you. If you don't, well, you're out. And
Yeah.
I think grad school really taught me all of this. And so it really was this moment where, again, everything sort of unraveled. But it was, I think, a long time in coming. And it was school or grad school that allowed me to actually think for myself.
Yeah. Do you think that the reason why you didn't pursue like a more progressive route for faith is because you had already had to like deconstruct the more evangelical part? Because I feel like um, for me, I mean, I was kind of getting that way. Like there was things like liberation theology that was very interesting to me, and I was really kind of checking that out toward the end. But I can't really escape the fact that I have a background in some pretty fundamentalist teachings whenever it comes to like, no, the Bible is 100% the literal word of God. And the way my mind works is just that, like, once I started deconstructing that and being like you said, I love how you put it, by the way, how this is, what did you say? These are words about God, not God's word, something along those
Yeah.
lines, which is kind of like saying this is not Spider-Man's words, but words about Spider-Man. Um, you know, and and I think once I did that, I mean, I just kind of leapfrogged over any other possibility because, for me, I was just like, I don't think there's a God at all now. Is there any? Do you think that had a part, or I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I mean, why didn't you like pursue these more progressive, more friendly to you as an individual um, options for faith?
So I did initially when I was at that point I was in Nashville, and so there was a church there that had a more progressive pastor. Like he was still part of, I think, like a non-denominational church, but and I
Hmm.
don't actually think I even went. No, I did go to this guy's church. I did. But I thought I was just listening to his sermons online. But I did go to the church. He was this um again, a non-denominational sort of non-denominational pastor, but he had recently had this big like revelation that it's okay to be gay. And so a lot of queers started going to his church. And so I did
Hmm.
go there for a bit. But I finished because I did my master's there. And then I taught for a year at a local liberal arts college. It was actually a Christian college. And then I moved to Florida for the PhD. And when I moved to Florida, I mean, I didn't have a car and I don't drive. And so I was like, well, I'm not about to like ride my bike to go to church, and I don't really want to go to church. And at that point, I had given up sort of like even interest in church. So in the
Hmm.
beginning, I had again, um, dabbled in sort of a more progressive, non-denominational church. But by the time I was in Florida, like I had no
Yeah.
incentive to go, and I didn't really want to go. Actually, one of my professors, weirdly enough, at a state Florida, like a Florida state school, said, if you want to come to my church. And I was like, nah, like I'm good. Cause she knew that I had struggled with the faith before.
Yeah.
So I think that, for me so I had that experience, but really at the end, like I wasn't about to go to any church because I didn't like whether they were progressive or not, because I just didn't believe that the God that they believed in was good. Like I was like, it's impossible to reconcile, you know, theodicy, like, and answer that question. And so I just was like, I don't want any church. I just want to, you know, chill on Sunday morning and sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. One of the things that kind of gets me is that thought that it seems like people don't ask that question. Like, how do I know that God is good if you still believe, how to because if you really take things back, like really go back all the way to Genesis, right? That Adam and Eve in this story, they I like to talk about this because it's really fun. It came to me late in life, and then to think about it now, I'm just like, why did I not see that before? But they were given a choice before they had the capability, according to the story, before they had the capability to truly have the ability to make the choice, right? And so, how would you know which one is telling the truth? Is it God or is it the talking snake? It's something I never thought about, and then whenever you start to really think about that and say, well, how do I know that God is good? Um, if I'm going by the words about him, in the book, they're not great. I mean, I still read often. I talk about this quite a bit on socials about how I read with my kid and one of my kids, and we're going through this, and it's so heinous, it's so terrible, and even if you're like, well, okay, these are just stories, fables, the telling a narrative of the Hebrew people and their journey. I'm like, this is like really elevating. It's like elevating the writer of the Saw movies to to like be your spiritual guide, because I mean they're just heinous, just absolutely terrible. Um, and I don't know why more people don't ask that question. How do I know that God is good? Uh, Other than divine command theory, which says that, well, if God does it, it's okay. But we're kind of held to a different standard. I think that's bullshit. So because then that gets away from being like, oh, this is my lightning rod for truth and how to do things. But it's different than what how we're supposed to live our life. So it is interesting that more people don't ask that question. And if it took Starbucks to get it for you, then that's awesome. Um, can you tell me more about your conversion therapy process that you didn't know was conversion therapy? Like, what goes into that? Again, my reference at this point is the "But I'm a Cheerleader" movie, so that's maybe not the best. I'd rather hear it from you, who's had some actual personal experience. Can you walk me through what that looks like?
Yeah. So, I mean, it looks different for every individual. But there are a lot of similar experiences. I mean, what I will say is that, and the research backs this up, is that conversion therapy at this point, happens disproportionately within religious communities. So, um, the vast majority of instances of conversion therapy are happening within religious context, specifically high control Christian context, which of course was my
Uh-huh.
experience. And so, for me, it was a talk therapy approach. There are other folks I know who went through electroshock therapy. There are other folks who went through aversion therapy, which of course electroshock therapy is perhaps like the most disgusting version of it, but there are other versions. For me, it was talk therapy. And so I would go on a weekly basis and I would talk to this pastor. His name again was Pastor Dane Emmerich. And he and I would do a few things. I mean, in the beginning, it was very much like setting the basis for the rest of the meetings. And so he had this very pseudo Freudian approach to human sexuality, where it was essentially that there must have been a problem or problems with my parents and my relationships. So
Uh-huh.
we went through and like talked about, what was your relationship like with your mom? And I was like, well, she was overbearing and she is wild. So that must be part of it. And then, or maybe all of it, because when we got to my dad was just amazing. Like I had a really, really great dad.
Yeah.
And so they were like, well, that doesn't fit the narrative. So let's push that out of the way and let's focus on your mom. So, and it was, it's always the woman, right? It's like, same with Adam and Eve. It's like, she did it. And then like,
Right.
okay,
Yeah.
um, story is, same story. So we focused on my mom and we focused on her being overbearing and that she, must have like, at a young age, I over-identified with her. And once I got to puberty, because I was over-identifying with her and living in the world of femininity so comfortably and, doing the things that girls do and talking about the things that girls talk about and play with and all this kind of stuff, that by the time I hit puberty, I, according to this theory, went for what was opposite of me, which would have been masculinity in boys and then eventually men. So this was the sort of intellectual, again, if we can use such a word and be so generous, sort of
Yeah.
foundation for our meetings. And so we looked at all these different relationships between my parents and then also my siblings and then also, friends and family, whatever. And then once we had sort of established that, we had a very routine series of meetings over the span of my 4 years at Liberty. We would talk about my uh every week I would go in, we would talk about what he referred to as my slip ups and my victories. So slip ups were moments where I gave into temptation, if I had looked at porn or if I had masturbated or if I had like even just looked at a guy lustfully, whatever it was, that was
Uh-huh.
something we had to sort of talk about. And then the other part of it was my victory or my victories. And so this was where I had avoided temptation. I would go for a run or I would hang out with a friend instead of doing something that I quote unquote shouldn't have been doing. So that was certainly part of it. We'd have that weekly inventory. We also read scripture together. We also prayed together. He always prayed for me. Like I never prayed for myself, which I think is quite telling that he was the one to intercede on
Mm.
my behalf. Of course, within,
Yeah.
Protestant Christians, we can all talk to God, but whenever we would pray, I
Sure.
never prayed for myself. It was always him. And then we would read a book. My book it was like a conversion therapy manual. It was called Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey. So this book by Alan Mettinger, who was a former president of Exodus International, it's just such a crazy book. And a lot of ways it actually reads like very sensually, almost like gay, like gay erotica at moments. Not erotica, but very homoerotic like undertones.
Yeah.
Um, and so I would read this, we would talk about it. And then there was always too, and this is something that I talk about now as well, was whenever we would like first meet each other, and then when I would say goodbye to him after each meeting, he would always give me this like weird big bear hug, and it was like overzealous and just like really
Mm,
looking back it like creepy, but at the time I just thought, oh, he's and I honestly thought about it as if he were like tutoring me and how to like good touch, bad touch. There's some men can touch each other without it
yeah.
being sexual. Meanwhile, but like I don't know if it wasn't all that. I think it was a little bit sexual for you, Dane. But he would forgive me this hug, and he did this with other people too. And then when we would pray, he would put his hands on my leg. And I remember, it was not like it wasn't low enough that I didn't notice. Like it wasn't like on my kneecap, so I would just like I wouldn't
Mhm,
even think about it or remember it. But it was never or it was never too high, but it was also never too low. So how do I put that? It was when he would put it on like halfway up my leg, it was enough to be like, oh, that's weird, but not high enough to be like, oh, don't do that.
mhm.
And so it was always this like towing the line and like just a really, really creepy thing looking back because obviously he was, enjoying it. But I found out from other people when they went through this as well, that same thing, he would do this with them as well. And again, they all said, like, people would say, like, again, it wasn't so high that you were like, stop, but it wasn't low enough that you didn't clock it. So
Yeah.
that was certainly part of it as well. But this was really the experience for me, by and large. But when I talk about it, I've had some people say like, well, that doesn't sound that bad. And it's like, first of all, that's a weird thing to say. But second of all, I think for me, like the violence of conversion therapy wasn't so much in the moment, as it was afterwards, because,
Mm,
I was promised that if I did X, Y, and Z, I would eventually find attraction to women, or at least a woman, whoever that unicorn of a woman is, or was.
mhm.
I never found her, but here we are. So it was, in the months and like the years after, I remember it was just this like cruel optimism that I had that eventually, if I just keep doing this, something will change, and it didn't. And within the evangelical imagination, God is good, God is perfect, and God wants me to change. But of course, I'm
Yeah.
not changing. I'm not changing. It's not obviously God's fault. Whose fault is it? Well, it's clearly it's me. I'm the problem. And of course, when you see yourself as a problem, that's a problem. So
Yeah.
that was really the violence for me, because eventually I turned on myself and I was like, I'm the issue. Like something's wrong with me. I'm fucked up. I need to do something, or and I don't know what it is, but I need to do something to change, and nothing's changing. So it really just created this cycle of, guilt, which turned into shame, which turned into self-hatred, which turned into like self-abnegation, and just, so on and so forth. And so it was a really sort of, uh, what's the word? Like, it was a lot of like mental gymnastics and mind games that I was sort of playing with myself at the end. In the beginning,
Yeah.
it was Dane sort of like setting the foundation, but by the end of it, I became my own jailer. I became my own monitor. I became my own sort of victimizer in a way. And that's what conversion
Yeah.
therapy does. It changes how you think and how you think about yourself to such an extent that you turn on yourself. And so that really
Mm,
is, again, the violence of conversion therapy was not so much in the moment as much as it was afterwards.
yeah. It's interesting you were talking about the placement of the hand on the leg, and I was just for a second thought, what if it was, a man and a woman and the same type of placement, you know, would that person, whoever was being touched, feel like that was appropriate? And the answer, I think, was we would probably all agree would be like, no, they probably would not think that it was appropriate. And a- as we go along, one of my favorite subreddits is Pastor Arrested. And in Pastor Arrested, there's story after story after story of somebody that's in the church and then they've done they get caught and then, something happens and, uh, well, they get arrested. And, and and, I'm hearing your story and I'm sitting there going, I wonder if anything ever came of that as far as, was there any accusations of impropriety afterwards, if I don't want to, not trying to paint that person in a bad light, but it would, as the kids say, it seems sus. That's all I'm saying.
Gene, I think he painted himself in a bad light. I think
Okay.
Pastor Dave
Okay.
did all the work himself. You don't need to, yeah, feel it anyway. You have to protect that guy. He,
Yeah.
um, as far as I know, um, well, what I will tell you, I have two confirmed cases of him hitting on students in like their DMs. I love it because he clearly doesn't know how like technology works. And I feel like I don't understand how technology works. And so just imagine how little he knows. Like
Yeah.
he would, um, and then I've seen screenshots of one of the conversations, and then I've also heard that the other guy was just reading it. We were one time talking, and he was just reading what Dane had read or sent him, and he was just like,
Mhm.
"You and your boyfriend look really good, like very handsome," and like just that creepy like old man
Mm.
hitting on, like it's just like
Yeah.
even more uncomfortable because it's coming from him, but also it's like language that we wouldn't use to like describe like what
Yeah.
we think. And so I know that he's hit on them privately. I've also seen there's one guy I follow who I know that they follow each other, and he's like incessantly commenting on his stuff about how handsome he is, how good
Mm.
looking he is, and all of this kind of stuff. And again, I just don't think that he knows that these are public comments. Like I think he thinks only he's gonna see it. And
Yeah.
so there's that. As for like any like I've never heard of a report of him, like anyone coming forward saying that he's done anything beyond like the leg touching and the hugs. Um, and to be honest, I don't actually think he has, like maybe he has, but I don't think he has. But again, the online stuff is certainly,
Yeah.
part of
It's
that
public
record.
and it seems, yeah, it seems sus.
It's just a
So
very weird thing to be saying to people that you've tried to change their sexuality that you're calling them handsome. You know what I mean? Like when,
right.
like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah. Be like seeing a former alcoholic and be like, wow, that beer looks really good. Anyway, um, so speaking of stories, this be a nice
Yeah,
segue. See how smoothly I did that right there. Just
great.
you might have helped me out a little bit. But stories, we can talk about your book. I have to look at it. Shame, sex, attraction. See, I almost said it wrong. Survivor stories of convert. How many survivors are we talking about here? How many stories do you
So
have?
in this collection, there are 17 stories, my story included, plus a forward by
Hmm.
Garrett Conley. So if you know the film Boy Erased, his memoir is what forms the basis of that film. It's based on his memoir.
So
And
what
so,
I'm hearing is I need to add this to my Pride watch for this year. Boy Erased.
yeah, it's a,
Okay,
it's a great
cool.
film. It's one of the very few films I saw in theaters. I rarely go to the movie theater, but I did go see that the moment I heard about it.
Uh-huh.
And I know Garrett, he's a wonderful guy. He's like super, super sweet. But so yeah, the collection has 17 stories. They run the gamut. So, they're mostly happening in Christian context, but there is a story from, an Orthodox Jewish context. There's a story from
Uh-huh.
a like non-religious context, and there's a story from what the author describes as a Chinese cult, but the rest are
Okay.
within Christian or sorry, Protestant, or but mostly Protestant, but a few Catholic stories, and mostly evangelical and like white Christian fundamentalist sort of contexts. Stories come from Canada, U.S., and Australia, and again, the stories are so different. Like, there's stories about group conversion therapy. There's stories about individual conversion therapy. There's stories where the person themselves became their own conversion therapist. There's a story about where the person was meeting with someone online as and they were their conversion therapist. And again, it sort of is just a mixed bag full of, again, really troubling stories and really sad stories. But there are a few stories that end really positively. Most don't actually. Most intentionally very much end on a negative note. But there are a few that
Uh-huh.
end, in a way that offers some sort of resolution. But most of them are, they don't offer that resolution in large part because we weren't given that resolution for a long time. And so the stories are intentionally written in a way
Oh,
to leave the reader feeling uncomfortable, to in some ways, some way, shape, or form mirror or
yeah.
signal how we were, so uncomfortable for so long.
Mm. Very interesting. And how did you go about finding these stories for a book? I mean, maybe there's no shortage of them. People just lining up like, I don't know. I could see where you might not want to talk about it. I mean, not everybody's willing to talk about leaving faith, for instance. And I could see where that it might be like ripping open some healed wounds that have formed some scars, and then you're like, no, 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 let's do this again, and we'll put it in a book so that way everybody can read about it. So how did you go about finding those stories and getting people to open up?
Yeah, you know what? It's funny too, like what you get known for. And for me, like I never thought what I would be known for is conversion therapy, but here we are. And I think that you're right. Like I think a lot of people, it was a difficult process for them to write their stories. But I'll rewind and then I'll get back to the discomfort. But for me, I had started writing about conversion therapy, my experience at Liberty, in more public facing venues, like mostly queer news outlets. And these little opportunities, one led to another, which led to, podcasts and radio interviews and this kind of stuff, just talking about it. And from it, I sort of created, I guess, like a body of, not a body of work, but like an online body of work that
Mhm.
allowed people to, like people started following and people started talking to me about their experiences. And so I sort of got plugged in with the Survivor Network. A lot of people were interested in chatting and I was too. And,
Huh.
um, I created, or I found myself in these different sort of survivor communities online. And one day I was actually at the doctor's and I got a message on Twitter, or the artist formerly known as Twitter. What's it
Yes.
called? Called X. Um,
X, yeah, yeah.
and and I got this message, and it was from this editor at a press saying, "Hey, we've been following your work on conversion therapy. Um, we think you might be the person to put together this edited collection of stories." And I was like, "What the heck?" I was like, "This is a scam. Like, this isn't real." Uh, Looked up the editor, I looked up the press, and they were both legitimate. I was like, "Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
what? Okay." So the press, we chatted about what we wanted. We both said that, we want to make sure that we're centering survivor stories. I don't want imaginative accounts. I want, you know, uh, non-fictional representations of survivors' experiences. So that's what we did. And I went to my networks that I had, tapped into and sort of found myself in, and said like, "Hey, I'm putting together a collection." So there were a few people who had already written their stories in some way, shape, or form, or had talked about it online. So they were willing. But then there were a lot of
mhm,
people who, just because my call for submissions was shared, they found me and then they submitted, and then I worked with the authors. I didn't accept all of the submissions. I accepted most, but what I had to do was, with some people who had never written before or published before, I had to sort of work with them to make sure that their story was, publishable. And so didn't change the content, just changed the form in some ways and just revised, revised, revised. And out of all the stories that were submitted, chose the ones that I thought were publishable. And
yeah,
from there, the collection came about, and it's been out for just over a year now. But it's been
okay,
a really cool experience being able to chat about the book and again hear a lot of people's experiences, because a lot of people do come out of the woodwork and like, yeah, that happened to me, or that something similar, not necessarily that, but something similar. And it's crazy the number of
yeah.
people who have gone through this.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about, by publishing a book and getting it out there and then people start reading it, if it led to even more people reaching out to you. I presume that the answer is probably a resounding yes. So, will it be a volume 2?
So there's not a volume two planned yet. I mean, that would be, I mean, I would love to do like a follow up, or, a
Mhm,
second sort of edition, of shame, sex, attraction. But what I will say is that, it's a different focus, but a lot of overlap and a number of stories that are
mhm,
about conversion in this collection too. The next collection is called Don't Ask, Tell All: Stories of Christian Colleges' Anti-Queer Regimes. And so it's looking at
mhm,
queer experiences and trans experiences at Christian colleges, universities, seminaries, and divinity schools. And
mhm.
that one, I'm supposed to get the reviews from my reviewers back in April. So
Oh,
what,
okay.
next month? And
Yeah,
then from there, publishing takes forever on the behind the scenes. So everything will be done, and, the book will be out likely early next year. And so that
mhm.
one is the next one. And then I'm currently talking with my publisher, because Shame, Sex, Attraction did decently well. They said, "Do you want to do another book?" And I was like, "Well, of course." And so
That's
that one
great.
will be about queer religious trauma. And that one will probably come out the year after.
Yeah. Uh, I I'd like to share a story with you that is, because I will say that the issue of queerness was the last thing to go. So many people say hell, right? Like, I'm afraid of hell, blah, blah, blah. that was not it for me. Like, I kind of, like, jettisoned that and was like, that doesn't really make sense if you really, really think about it, about so but for me, let's say I don't know, let's say you have a kid that identifies as gay, right? Oh, I do. And so then how do I, as I'm coming out of this, I'm done with church, I'm done with God, done with thinking about, if God's real or not. I've already made up in my mind that I'm like, no, I don't believe in this anymore. But I still have these roots that go back pretty far, even though I never um, was mean to anyone, about their identity whenever it came to that stuff. I still had my own like bullshit thoughts that kind of talking points is more what they were that you that you get that get thrown at you and one of the things is that my daughter she wanted the lesbian flag, for like a Christmas gift or birthday gift, I can't remember, but and I was cleaning her room and because she needs help cleaning her room because it was very, very bad. And so I'm in there, and as I'm cleaning, I noticed the flag hanging on the wall, and I was like, it's still like wrinkled. It's got the little creases and stuff from coming in the packaging, because it's all folded. And I'm like, well, that's not acceptable. I'm gonna go iron that, right? So because I'm Gen X, so I know how to iron. So I go, I go and I'm ironing this, and I'm like, I'm taking great care to make sure that this thing looks good because I want it to look good for her. And that's when I realized that finally, like that part of me had, um, left because I'm like, this is not important at all. I mean, it is important in the sense that it's a part of who she is, or if it's a part of who you are. It's part of your identity, but it's not important as like a thing that it's not bad. It just is. And so, and it was an incredibly freeing moment for me to iron a lesbian flag and get the wrinkles out. And and she made a good joke that she's like, "Well, now it's straight," and I'm like, "Yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. It is straight now." So, but it is such a sad thing that the that religious communities feel like you have to try to change somebody um, whenever just accepting, and as long as it's not, as long as it's consensual, normal, that regardless of any orientation, like it has to be um, you know on the level. um, Nobody should have to go through what you or anybody in your book has had to go through, and so I'm hopeful for a better future. And one of the things that I um, noted when watching Shiny Happy People, like season 2, like they talked about Teen Mania and all that kind of stuff, and it wasn't until somebody started getting putting stuff online, writing a blog, and then other people started, coming out of the woodworks and really sharing their stories. I think what you're doing is very important. So that way it helps other people share their stories, get it out there, discussing it, and then let's shut that shit down. So
Yeah.
I live in Missouri in the United States, and in southern Missouri, there is a conversion therapy place that comes up in the news every so often, allegations of abuse, shockingly. And so it's a topic that needs to be addressed because it just seems like abuse to me, to try to rewire somebody against just who they were born as. I mean,
Yeah.
that's wrong. And so, um, well, so what do you think? What's the, what's your future look like next, other than waiting for the book? I mean, just living your life and and I don't know. Tell
That's,
me, what's the next
well,
step?
you were talking about Teen Mania, and then the next book, I have a story from a contributor who went to Teen Mania, and it's his
Hmm.
experience at Teen Mania. So that, if that's of interest
Oh,
to anyone,
okay.
it's actually like kind of, yeah, a wild story. But um, so And actually one other thing that makes me think about what you just said, you were saying that like kind of one of the last things for you when you were going through your deconstruction process was, um, you know, uh, working through the homophobia and sort of, I guess
Mhm.
transphobia that a lot of us have been sort of given,
Yeah.
and we've adopted. And I had the same thing too, right? Where I was like, it was internalized homophobia. That's what conversion therapy is. It's internalized. It's homophobia that is given to you, then you internalize it, and then you try to change yourself after someone's trying to change you, right? So,
Mhm.
but I think about homophobia and transphobia as like the last frontier in a lot of ways, because I think that both of them are considered like respectable hatreds in the sense that if I
Oh,
said,
yeah.
to a congregation like, oh, women, they should be, they're second class citizens or they should be beneath men, blah, 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 even though people still do say that. So I can't even use that as an example. Let's use racism as an example. If someone was openly racist from a church
Oh,
pulpit,
wait
they'd
a
be,
minute. Oh, yeah. See,
yeah. And
everyone, you're
the
like,
same,
"Oh, I'll use this as an example," and then you're like, "Oh, damn it. No,
but
that's
it's
still a
like, here's
problem."
the thing. I
Yeah.
think to myself, it's like, it's rightfully so. Everyone should be up in arms. Like, if anyone's saying racist shit, well, of course we should be up in arms.
Yes.
I find that with homophobic stuff coming out of the pulpit, people will say, well, come on, that's just their religious belief. And it's a respectable hatred. It's a hatred that people are like, well, at the end of the day, it's just what they believe. And it's like, we should
Mhm.
not have that for take your pick on any sort of form of hatred. If we're talking about racism, we're talking about sexism, we're talking about misogyny, we're talking about homophobia, like none of these are good, but
Yeah.
homophobia is still allowed within church circles or like even within like more progressive people or like liberal folks. They'll say, well, that's just their belief. And it's like, no, it's not just their belief. Like, how are you in any way defending, these talking points, these beliefs, these theologies? It's ridiculous. And so I think it only makes sense that for you, that one of the last things that you were working through was that, because again, I think that even outside of religious circles, people in some ways will defend homophobia, and it's bonkers to me because
Mhm.
again, it's like every other hatred. It's all bad, and we should be fighting and speaking against it. But for a lot of people make excuses or concessions because they think, well, at the end of the day, it's just their belief, and it's bullshit to me. But
Yeah.
just something that I thought about after what you were saying. As for what's next, I mean, I have the next book coming out next year, and then the one after that, the year after. But I mean, I just at this point, I'm really uh, working on those projects. I mean, my contract for my current postdoc ends at the end of August. So if anyone's looking for a researcher and wants to hire me, or if you want me to copy edit whatever, let me
Yeah.
know. But yeah, that I'm now in the process of that really fun process of looking for what comes next and what
Right.
my job will be. So
Yeah.
that'll be within the next few months. I'll know what my future is, but I'm hoping it'll be again within academia, so I can continue doing this kind of work because there's nothing else I'd rather do.
That's awesome. It's a great, I think it's great that you found, what you love doing. And you get to tap into that. And, one of the things that you said earlier, you've mentioned a couple of times you've regretted or, a little bit of where you went. But I would argue that you wouldn't be here, nor would I, if it wasn't for that. And that's the thing. Like it's really hard to accept that reality that I wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for those things, even though if I had my preferences, I think I would have rather not have gone through those things.
Mhm.
But yet I'm really happy with who I am now. I'm so happy with with who I am, how I accept people better. I hope they accept me a little. Um, and I'm just I it's kind of hard, like to deal with the regret of what I think. I wish that maybe I could have skipped it, and then also acknowledging that I probably wouldn't be where I am today without it. So kind of a
Yeah.
catch 22.
No, I think it's absolutely true. And I mean, for me, it's like, I do regret it. Like, and I 100% sort of, I 100% stand behind that. However, like you said, I wouldn't be here right now. I wouldn't be doing the things that I'm doing without it. So although I have the regrets, I'm also not like, what's the word? Like self-flagellating and like berating
Yeah,
myself at this. God, look what you did.
exactly.
Like that. I made the decisions that
Hmm.
I made, and I wish that they didn't happen. But at the end of the day, I'm very, very thankful, yeah, for where I am today. And even if my experiences weren't the best years ago, my life right now is phenomenal. So I can't complain.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, hopefully the work that both of us are doing will help other people moving forward. And you know what? Maybe we had to wade through some shit so that way other people could, you know, just walk on the sidewalk and be normal and happy. So that's all good.
Yes, sir.